Hey everybody, thanks for checking out my channel. I'm Russ, and this is the 80s are Russ. Well, my last video contained some divisive opinions regarding Ganon's role in the overarching legendary chronology of Zelda, and this video was coming sooner or later anyway, so sooner it is. What a bummer. I get to ramble about my favorite character in the franchise. His name is Ganondorf Dragmire. A name technically created for the American version of A Link to the Past. The Japanese version had only ever referenced him without a surname, and Nintendo didn't officially canonize it until 2017, though it's become popularly headcanoned by most American players. It's pretty fucking cool sounding after all. Ganondorf Dragmire. Anywho, I'm here to talk about my headcanon origins of this iconic Gerudo desert-dwelling king of thieves and almost unopposed ruler of the baddest bitches this side of the Sahara. He inherits a legacy of particularly toxic masculinity at a level of literally royal gender inequality, all by apparent design within this bizarre, secluded, sand-loving culture. Just a fair trigger warning for some of the coming topics. Those of you who like a squeaky clean Zelda universe, devoid of the darker elements the series only occasionally embraces, might want to pay closer attention after the time displayed on screen now. Not every ending in Hyrule is happy. Okay, full disclosure, this isn't entirely related, but I just want to get something out of the way before we really get going. Did you know how many shippers of these two there are? Pretty wild rabbit hole that was. That's only vaguely related to the topic at hand, however. This guy. Or, more specifically, this guy. Whoa, hold on, that imposter is part of a new, disconnected timeline, and it doesn't fit with the established lore, or does it? I'll agree. At first, it was a perplexing addition. An entirely new version of Ganondorf, clearly predating the earliest established incarnation by potentially centuries? What the fuck, Nintendo? This isn't my Ganondorf. Who's this new guy? How ironic. Me mistaking the Prince of Demons for my most familiar incarnation of the true demonic overlord. The version I grew up with. The Demon King was this fella's father all along, after all. Or grandfather, maybe? This is actually somewhat flexible depending on how strictly you interpret the time frames given within Zelda's expansive lore, as well as how you interpret someone reincarnating into themselves. But the logic is still sound. Hear me out, we're just getting started. And this essentially amounts to a rule of two of sorts for the male members of the Gerudo. It's slightly more complicated than that, but we'll get there. So, the Gerudo tribe is a weird one. I think we can all agree on that much, but how did they get this way? On the surface, it's surprisingly easy to disregard a lot of the disturbing stuff that must result from this kind of society existing alongside more traditional settlements, not to mention the implications of any strictly single-gender situation as expansive as this ancient desert culture. They've presumably been organized, however barbarically, for several generations by the time they first took the spotlight in Ocarina of Time, and while it's commonly believed that they don't even exist as early as Skyward Sword, I would argue that they're simply not shown in a significant capacity, unless you count her as a significant capacity. But since the word Gerudo isn't specifically associated with Impa in the game's text, that's not widely accepted as lore canon, as far as I know. But the word Gerudo isn't absent from the game, and maybe a dragonfly isn't much, but to me, this indicates an existing Gerudo society of some sort, or that the word Gerudo predates the people, perhaps as the name of a region that these insects are native to. Regardless, I believe Impa is from this theoretical early Gerudo tribe, upon which the Sheikah would eventually base and uphold their traditions, and I believe they were quite close to the goddesses. Perhaps a bit too coincidentally similar to a certain wind tribe? It's worth noting that this Impa is specifically stated to be a being sent forth by the goddess to aid Zelda in her quest, which fits nicely with my idea once everything's laid out. Back on that previous comment though, yes, I believe, as some others do, that the Wind Tribe and the Gerudo are one and the same, or two halves of a once whole, as it were, a singular tribe destined to be forcibly split, originating on an ancient surface world, predating all of Hyrule Kingdom and its centuries of cyclical history. I imagine this small sect of humanity as being versed in many earthly magics, mastering the elements and even breaking the barriers of death in the afterlife. Having the trust of the goddesses, they were allowed to wield the talents of deities like playthings, perhaps to a reckless degree, but as they were favored by the creators, they drew the undesired, unnoticed attention of other entities. Perhaps some of whom were jealous of these mortals sharing the power of gods. Those envious enough to take action might have been regarded as interlopers of sorts. At least one, though, had agendas. Arguably the most thoughtful of the demon kings we've seen, this guy marks the calendar for generations to come. His plans are layered like an onion wedding cake straight out of Dante's Inferno, and he had a score to settle. With a certain goddess and her pathetic excuse for a champion of those precious little chosen people she loved so much. He would handpick his target carefully, someone with a malleable will and the potential for working behind enemy lines, someone with a surprising ingenuity under the surface, and carefully, quietly, creeping in the shadows, he would lay the foundation for the long con of an eternity. He had to be patient, after all. See, I believe good old Groosey got ghosted. Not in the most traditional sense, maybe, and I don't even mean by Zelda, but by Demise, who had a plan for this pompous, pompadour-loving ginger Johnny Bravo. See, such a powerfully manipulative evil entity would likely take notice of his little bond with Elder Impa, a member of the clan with ties to his hated rival goddess. And even if the connection hadn't happened naturally, he could probably have coerced it somehow. Who's to say he didn't? So a curse is placed, spawning a demonic whisper of power, something that would feed on Groos's soul over time, possibly even affecting his behavior and outward appearance. Maybe not. It could start with an unlucky offspring or further descendant, but regardless, he was trapped by the gravity well of Ganon's early genesis. Ultimately, Groos got intimate with Gerudo culture, and in my headcanon he probably even ended up directly affecting their dominant hair and eye colors. But don't get carried away, shippers. I'm not talking about genetics or direct lineage, necessarily. If you'd prefer to just go that route with it, they couldn't possibly sustain multi-generational gingerhood for very long. It is a recessive trait after all. But Ganon would need followers, and his intentions weren't exactly pure, so there's definitely some unsavory citizen selection going on. The most loyal followers would be blessed by their one true king, who was seen as a savior of the Gerudo through twisted gaslighting and literal demonic rhetoric, possibly even mystical brainwashing. Particularly impressive ranks were even magically imbued with the traits representing their leader: deep, blood-red locks and a sinister, soul-penetrating golden gaze. Most trusted amongst his ranks, though, would be a sibling pair of powerful witches, the Twin Rova, who were well studied in ancient rituals of resurrection and reincarnation. They would assist their demon dictator's gestation with the darkest of magics over untold generations, transferring his mind and power down through the bloodline when each new heir was properly prepared, literally shifting the entire course of Gerudo history. Twin Rova would use unnatural, life-lengthening magics and twisted manipulation to elongate their hellish master's mortal supremacy over his masses through each new iteration. Many of these historical hosts would in turn create deliberate internal conflict, stoking the flames of distrust and ultimately weeding out any kingly competition by enforcing a swift, genocidal approach to all potential encroachments of power. Eventually, the demon's chosen bloodline would have entirely singled itself out as the only one suitable for leadership, let alone royalty. The eventual, radical result of all this manufactured hostility is the mass execution of all males in the clan apart from the king himself, who had come to achieve a century-long lifespan in his latest incarnations. This is actually where I think the Wind Tribe comes in, as I believe they're a splinter of the Gerudo who saw Ganon's host for the destructive force he truly represented. Everything they knew, their entire way of life, was being destroyed through generations of demonic infestation, and rather than submit to a force it was too late to oppose, they chose to flee. They left Hyrule with what little they could salvage of their once prosperous and noble culture and settled in the sky in an attempt to be close to their goddesses once again. A slightly happy ending for them, all things considered, and this would explain why there are so few males amongst the Sky Dwellers. Potentially only 2, who happen to have a very notable age gap. If these are the remnants of a settlement similar to what I just described, I think I can explain these 2 and their significant age difference, and even why this guy has a ghostly death curse hovering around his old head. Back to that later, though. After centuries of growth, after an eternity of test driving and a demonic line of reincarnating descendants, and having now mercilessly slaughtered every last Gerudo male, and probably any known opposition amongst the females, Ganon had gradually sculpted the king he desired as his ultimate host, one worthy of his true power and ambition. This king would be named Ganondorf. Which, if I'm taking any liberties I want, I'd theorize translates to something like Son of Ganon, or Ganon's Son, in some version of ancient Gerudo text. Maybe even just Demon Son, and maybe Ganon is just the Gerudo word for demon. This could be why he only goes by Ganon when he's going full demon. To be clear, there's no known evidence of this. It's just a fun idea that works pretty well if you think about it. And it's why the whole rule of two concept kind of fits when you squint at it. This guy's like Palpatine going body hopping into the next best battery for his juice. So yeah, at the end of the day, this guy is just a groomed up Vader for Daddy Ganon to take the reins of after a long time out in the corner of the Sacred Realm. And to bring relevance to a certain fan coupling I mentioned earlier, while I've never shipped these two as an age-inappropriate odd couple, I do think their connection during Skyward Sword is important. They clearly bond, and I think this is a friendship with consequences. Seemingly good consequences early on, probably with a fair amount of cultural bonding, but with sinister plans at work behind the scenes. Now, what makes this appear tricky for the timeline is how certain games represent the presence of the Gerudo, or lack thereof. Personally, I think if we lay it out like this, there's a pretty obvious pattern. Keep in mind, this timeline of events includes details from my theory about Echoes of Wisdom and where I feel it falls on the timeline as we know it. Feel free to check that video out after you finish this one. So if this theory holds water, it would go something like this. Between the events of Skyward Sword and Echoes of Wisdom would be all that wild Gerudo culture fragmentation, with Ganondorf coming to power and molding his faithful cult of followers into their modern, more familiar structure. Sometime during that mess, the Wind Tribe would slink away and establish their hideaway in the sky. Sadly, with most of their unbrainwashed kin wiped out, the only males left are this elderly man and the would-be next-in-line host for Ganon, the youngest new king to have inherited the throne at birth. Fortunately for him, his family caught wind of the Twin Rova's planned ritual of demonic data transference and bailed with their baby before any Ganon executables could get permanently installed, which created a countdown to colossal system failure for his father, this elderly man. I fully realize I'm wading into controversial waters with this one, but I think what happened here was an interruption of the aforementioned ritual. It makes sense to me that if they were mid-transfer when their skyward escape took place, the untethered but lingering Hellspawn would be detached from its prior host body, but with no new one to hop into, Ganon's essence would now leech the life force of this potentially a century-old man, awaiting an opportunity to find his way back to the desert to re-establish his rule through a new physical form. So, whether Link chooses to bust Casper Ganon or let the old guy die of his apparition affliction, it's pretty clear that Ganon's ghostly form would find some way back home to continue the twisted family tradition. And if the whole premise of all this sounds pretty far-fetched, I should remind you that we now have a minimum of 2 known canon instances of Ganondorf reincarnating. Not into a new person who happens to remember his past lives, but just straight up Ganondorf 2 Electric Boogaloo. It would be easier to ignore this possible ancestral connection between our OG OOT Ganondorf and the somewhat fan-based maligned version introduced in Tears of the Kingdom, except we've seen this exact form of reincarnation before, in the somewhat less fan-based maligned version introduced in Four Sword Adventures. As for certain other aliases of the original model Blue Pig Monster, I think the whole reason he created the Aghanim alter ego during the Downfall Timeline's events is because that version of Ganondorf was the one we see in his pre-Piggy form for the first time here, before the original Timeline's imprisoning war that sealed his power in the kingdom he had created for himself by literally polluting the Sacred Realm with his darkness. And if you recall, it's made clear in this classic lore drop that Ganondorf had made quick work of whatever leftover loyalists he may have had once acquiring his prized golden power, hence their complete absence for the remainder of the Downfall timeline, and thus removing nearly any possibility of Echoes of Wisdom occurring after A Link to the Past, as has been a surprisingly popular theory due to some frankly kind of flimsy map landmark evidence. Ruins can be rebuilt after all, but extinction is a little more complicated to overcome. This reckless mistake would cost him all he had gained through his long lineage, centuries of planning reduced to pig slop, leading to his own ultimate downfall in the kingdom he'd once conquered. That'll do it for this entry, but stay tuned for my next video, which will outline the goddess Hylia's ultimate plan to restore her sacred timeline, cleansing it of Ganon's influence through the heroic intervention of a sleepy time-traveling savior, a boy who I theorize was enslaved and eventually ended by Ganondorf in the Downfall timeline. I'll elaborate on that next time. Thanks for watching.